Listen close, Marullo. You smell that? That's not diesel. That's not salt water. That's something older. Something that shouldn't be breathing, but does anyway. And before you ask me what the hell I'm talking about, understand this. There are cargo manifests in this world that list things as machinery parts or agricultural equipment when they should just say, sealed, do not open. Pray it stays that way. The year was 1963, February. Cold as a grave offshore, which is fitting because that's exactly what the SS Marine Sulphur Queen was about to become. She was a converted tanker, 524 feet of rusted steel, built to carry something no sensible sailor would want in their hold. Molten sulfur, 15,000 tons of it, heated to 275 degrees Fahrenheit, liquid as blood and twice as hungry. You ever see sulfur burn? I have. It doesn't just consume. It transforms, turns everything it touches into something that was never meant to exist. Now imagine that, but contained in a ship held together by rivets and prayers, crewed by 39 men who signed on because they had bills to pay and families to feed. Good men, dead men walking if they'd known what I know now. The Queen left Beaumont, Texas on the 2nd of February. Standard run to Norfolk, Virginia. Should have taken 5 days, maybe 6 if the weather turned. The cargo was loaded proper, or so the manifest said. But here's what you need to understand about ships that carry death in their bellies. Proper don't mean safe. Proper just means everyone's covered their ass on paper. Captain James Martin was no fool. 53 years old, been sailing these waters since before most of his crew was born. He knew the Queen had problems. Hell, everyone knew. She'd been inspected 2 weeks prior, and the surveyors found cracks in her hull, long enough to slide your arm through. Found fire damage in the crew quarters. Found valves that didn't seal, and pumps that wheezed like tubercular lungs. And you know what they did? They let her sail anyway. Because that's how it works, boy. Ships like the Queen, they're too expensive to ground. The cargo's too valuable to leave sitting in port. So they patch her up with steel band-aids and send her out into the Gulf. And everyone pretends not to hear the groaning in her bones. The first day out was smooth. Routine radio checks, position reports, everything by the book. On February 4th, at 1:25 in the morning, the Queen radioed her position. She was off the Florida Keys, making good time. The radio operator on the other end noted it in his log, standard transmission. No distress, no indication that anything was wrong. That was the last time anyone heard from the SS Marine Sulphur Queen. Now, you might think a ship that size, carrying that much cargo, couldn't just vanish. You'd be wrong. The Coast Guard launched a search operation that covered over 350,000 square miles of ocean. They found life jackets. They found a few pieces of debris. They found a name board torn from the wheelhouse, scorched black around the edges. But they never found the ship. And they sure as hell never found those 39 men. The official inquiry took 18 months. Coast Guard investigators pored over every detail. They interviewed the surveyors who'd inspected the Queen. They examined the cargo procedures. They studied weather patterns and ocean currents. And in the end, they published a report that was mostly filled with words like possibly and may have and insufficient evidence. But buried in that report, if you know where to look, there's a line that'll make the hair on your neck stand up. The vessel was not seaworthy and should not have been permitted to sail. 17 words that translated meant 39 men were sent to their deaths for profit. Here's what the investigators think happened, though they couldn't prove it. The Queen had a structural defect in her sulfur tanks. The molten cargo, constantly moving with the roll of the ship, had been eating away at the weakened steel. Maybe it was gradual, maybe it was sudden, but at some point, those tanks ruptured. Imagine it. You're down in the engine room or up on deck checking the lines. Suddenly, there's a sound like a rifle shot, only it echoes through the whole ship. Steel screaming. Then the heat hits you, not like standing near a fire, like being inside one. Molten sulfur, liquid and hungry, pouring through the ruptured bulkheads. Sulfur doesn't just burn. It produces sulfur dioxide gas, colorless, heavier than air. It sinks into every compartment, every crawl space, every place a man might think to hide. You breathe it in. Your lungs start to blister from the inside. Your eyes water, your throat closes. You can't scream because there's no air left to scream with. The ship's breaking apart now. The weight of the cargo, no longer properly contained, shifts. The Queen lists hard to starboard. Water's pouring in through the ruptured hull. But you can't get to the lifeboats because the deck's coated in liquid fire. You can't radio for help because the equipment's already melted. You can't do anything except hold on to whatever's close and pray it's quick. Some of the investigators think the Queen went down in less than a minute. Others say she might have struggled for 5, maybe 10. Either way, when that much molten sulfur hits cold seawater, it creates a reaction that's more explosion than sinking. The ship doesn't just go down. She's torn apart, atomized, scattered across the ocean floor in pieces too small to find. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. It makes me check the locks on the hatches twice before I sleep. 3 months after the Queen disappeared, fishermen off the coast of Florida started pulling up strange catches. Fish with lesions on their skin, crabs with shells that looked melted and reformed, and the smell, God, the smell. Light matches and rotting eggs and something else underneath. Something chemical and wrong. They tested the water, found traces of sulfur compounds that shouldn't have been there, found them in concentrations high enough to kill. And here's the question nobody wanted to ask. If the Queen's cargo sank with her, if it's sitting on the ocean floor in some deep trench, what happens to 15,000 tons of sulfur over time? Does it just stay there? Or does it seep out, slow and patient, poisoning everything it swims past? I talked to a salvage diver once, a man named Ricketts. He'd been part of a commercial operation working the Gulf. They dropped sonar on a wreck, something big, right in the area where the Queen went down. The readings were strange. The metal signature was off, like the ship had been partially dissolved. Ricketts wanted to dive it, get a positive identification, maybe recover something for the families. His company said no, told him the site was too deep, too dangerous. But Ricketts, he did some digging. Found out there'd been 3 other dive operations that had surveyed that same wreck. All 3 had declined to go down. When he pushed for reasons, all he got was vague talk about environmental concerns and unsafe conditions. So Ricketts, being the stubborn bastard he was, went down anyway. Unofficial dive, just him and a buddy. They got to about 200 feet when his buddy's regulator started acting up. Couldn't get a clean breath. Tasted like chemicals. They aborted, came back up. Later, when they examined the equipment, the rubber seals on the regulator had degraded. Looked like they'd been exposed to acid. The thing is, boy, the ocean don't forgive, don't forget. The Queen's down there somewhere, and whatever killed her, whatever transformed those men from sailors into statistics, it's still there. Still waiting. The sulfur doesn't evaporate, doesn't dilute. It just sits in the dark, 3,000 feet down, patient as death. There are shipping lanes that pass right over that area now. Container ships, oil tankers, cruise liners. Thousands of passengers who have no idea they're sailing over a grave that's still bleeding poison into the water. And sometimes, on calm nights when the currents are right, fishermen say they can smell it. That match-strike stench of sulfur dioxide rising up from the deep. The families of the Queen's crew spent years fighting for compensation. The company that owned the ship, Marine Transport Lines, they went bankrupt before the litigation concluded. The insurance companies settled for pennies on the dollar. In the end, most of those families got nothing except a flag and a letter thanking them for their husbands, their fathers, their sons' service to American commerce. Captain James Martin's widow lived until 1998. 35 years she spent wondering if her husband suffered, if he knew what was coming, if he had time to think of her before the ship took him. She gave an interview once, late in life. Said she still couldn't eat eggs because the smell of sulfur reminded her of him. Said she'd wake up sometimes and swear she could hear his voice calling from somewhere far away, somewhere deep and dark and cold. You think that's superstition? Think that's just an old woman's grief talking? Let me tell you something about ships, about the sea, about the things we carry in our holds and think we can control. The ocean's got a memory longer than ours. Every ship that goes down, every crew that's lost, it adds to that memory, becomes part of it. The water remembers the Queen, remembers those 39 men, remembers what we did to them in the name of profit and expedience. And here's the truth that'll make you check your cargo manifest twice before you sail. The Marine Sulphur Queen wasn't unique. There were other ships just like her, still are. Tankers carrying chemicals that could eat through steel. Container ships loaded with cargo that's mislabeled because the truth would cause too many questions. Vessels that are one bad weld, one corroded valve, one ignored inspection report, away from becoming the next cautionary tale that sailors whisper about in port. The Coast Guard's report on the Queen made recommendations, stricter inspection protocols, better safety standards for chemical carriers, mandatory structural surveys. And you know what happened? Some of it got implemented. Most of it got watered down by industry lobbying. Because ships need to sail, cargo needs to move. And if we grounded every vessel that wasn't truly seaworthy, half the merchant fleet would be sitting in port, so they still sail. Ships with cracks in their hulls and patches on their patches. Crews who know the vessel's not right, but need the paycheck. Captains who file reports that get buried under paperwork. And every now and then, one of them doesn't make it home. Disappears between one port and the next. Gets added to the list of marine casualties. Lost at sea, presumed sunk. And the ocean, that vast and patient and indifferent thing, it takes them all. Holds them down there in the dark, where the sulfur keeps seeping, where the steel keeps corroding, where whatever's in the cargo hold keeps feeding on everything that falls. I've been to sea 42 years, boy. Seen things that would make a preacher doubt his God. But I'll tell you what scares me most. It's not the storms, not the pirates, not even the machinery that could crush you in half a heartbeat. It's the cargo. The things we seal in the holds and pretend we understand. The chemicals, the compounds, the substances that exist in states that aren't quite liquid, aren't quite solid, aren't quite anything that belongs in the natural world. We load that poison into ships, held together by steel and faith. We send those ships into the deepest, darkest waters on Earth. And we trust that nothing will go wrong, that the container will hold, that the seal won't break, that whatever's down there in the hold, hungry and patient and waiting, won't find a way out. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen left port on February 2nd, 1963. She was scheduled to arrive in Norfolk on February 7th. The dock workers were ready. The families were waiting. The company had already lined up the next cargo run. Everything was planned. Everything was scheduled. Everything was going to proceed like clockwork. But the Queen never docked, never arrived, never came home. And somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, 3,000 feet down where the light never reaches and the pressure could crush a man flat in seconds, she's still there, still carrying her cargo, still feeding the ocean with 15,000 tons of poison that'll leach into the water for the next 1,000 years. They say you can't smell sulfur underwater. The human nose wasn't designed for it. But the divers who work those depths, they'll tell you different. They'll tell you there are places where the water tastes wrong, where your skin starts to itch inside your wetsuit, where the fish won't go and the coral grows in twisted, unnatural shapes. They'll tell you there are wrecks down there that shouldn't be touched, shouldn't be disturbed, shouldn't even be approached, because whatever's in those cargo holds, it's still hungry, still patient, still waiting for the next fool who thinks he knows better. The Marine Sulphur Queen took 39 men with her. Good men. Sailors who knew the risks but trusted their ship anyway. Trusted the company that owned her. Trusted the inspectors who cleared her to sail. Trusted the system that was supposed to keep them safe. That trust killed them. And 50-some years later, their ship's still out there. Still bleeding poison into the Gulf. Still teaching the same lesson over and over to anyone smart enough to listen. There are some things you don't put in the hold. Some cargo that shouldn't be carried. Some risks that aren't worth any amount of money. But we don't listen, do we? We never do. We just load the holds and seal the hatches and point the bow toward open water. And we tell ourselves it'll be different this time, that we're smarter now, that we've learned from the past. We tell ourselves whatever's in the cargo hold, it's under control, it's sealed, it's safe. We tell ourselves it's not hungry. We tell ourselves that right up until the moment the hatches burst open, and the steel starts screaming, and the water turns to fire, and we realize, far too late, that some things were never meant to be carried across the sea. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen. Remember that name. Remember those 39 souls. And if you ever find yourself signing onto a ship whose hull groans a little too loud, whose pumps rattle a little too much, whose cargo manifest lists substances you can't pronounce, remember this: the ocean's already too full of ghosts. Don't add yours to the count. Because whatever's in the cargo hold, Marullo, whatever they sealed down there and told you was safe, you need to understand one thing. It's not just cargo. It never was. It's hungry, always has been, always will be. And the moment you stop respecting that hunger, the moment you think you've got it contained, that's when it feeds. That's when the hold opens. That's when you learn what it means to carry death across the water. And by then, boy, it's already too late to run.